on additional documentation because this is huge in terms of Brexit. As those third country rules apply and we start to import and export, there's a lot more documentation that needs to accompany our goods as a third country. I'm going to expand on the origin that we've been talking about over recent weeks and give you some examples of how some of those origin rules are applied in practice. We're going to talk about valuation build-up and look closely at method 1, which I've touched on in the past, which is the transactional value. And I'm going to go through the charges and the deductions that can be incorporated into that valuation. Again, valuation is just on import, it's not an export consideration, but you have to appreciate that your customers in the export scenario are going to be doing that valuation build-up on UK goods going into the EU. Then we're going to talk about payment of duty and VAT, specifically looking at deferment and also postponed VAT accounting. And then we'll talk a little bit about the essentials of customs compliance. What is incumbent on you as the importer or exporter of record to ensure that's in place? And then we'll touch on customs simplified procedures for export and import, and also how they're referenced within the declaration as well, and the kind of codes. We know from the clients that we're supporting across the UK currently that certainly on export declarations, they're freight forwarders that are acting on their behalf, asking them to start to put customs procedure codes on their commercial invoice, because the freight forwarder draws a lot of information from the commercial invoice in order to make the declaration. So I think it's important that you understand how customs procedure codes are structured. Okay. So new processes and requirements as of the 1st of January. So we know that the world is changing. We know that the way we trade with the EU is changing, irrespective of whether or not there's a UK-EU trade deal struck over the coming days. So the first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is these safety and security declarations. So they are used by border authorities and they're all about risk. Okay, so border authorities need to know the goods that are coming into their territory, the goods that are crossing the border, to determine, you know, what level of risk they pose. So it's not about duties and taxes, it's all about risk. And there's two types of declaration. There's an exit summary declaration and there's an entry summary declaration. So the exit summary declaration is nearly always completed just on the standard full export declaration. So that the SAD or the C88 that we talk about, almost always the exit summary declaration is part of that full declaration, if you like. But the entry summary declaration is completed separately. Okay, so you typically have to file an entry summary declaration in advance of your goods arriving in the UK. Then customs declarations, we know that they're going to be mandatory. We know that we're going to be using the C88 to file our import and export declarations. And we're going to talk through a little bit later on about the core data that goes into those declarations. We know that pre-notifications and authorizations are going to be increasingly relevant. So there are certain commodities or products that are going to require those pre-notifications and authorizations. So an example I would use is those trees and plants and seeds that are brought into England and Wales, so slightly separate border control regulations for the devolved administrations. They are going to need, those certain commodities are going to need to be registered with the Animal and Plant Health Agency, so APHA, for example. So in advance of importing those goods, you're going to need to pre-notify APHA and receive an authorization from them that you're bringing, that it's okay to bring those goods in. And that's typically done either before the goods come into the UK or at least within 5 days of the arrival of those goods in the UK. So we know that notion of pre-notification and authorization is going to be an increasing requirement for certain goods. We know that there's going to be requirements for additional documentation, and we'll go through the list in a while, but it's all of the documentation. If you trade outside of the EU currently, so you're used to shipping goods or receiving goods from the rest of the world, then you'll be familiar with the kind of additional documentation that you need to provide. but that's certainly going to be a requirement, and obviously it bears a cost as well. So, you know, obtaining those additional certificates for consignments has a cost, which impacts your margin if you're not offsetting that cost to your customers, or say, for example, your suppliers aren't covering that cost. We know that there's going to be more customs compliance checks. So UK goods entering the EU and EU goods entering the UK are going to be subjected to a increased documentary, physical and identity checks at customs. Okay, so those customs checks are usually carried out by the customs office, and it can be because there's doubts regarding the customs declaration, or they're monitoring specific commodities, or there might be just something suspicious, or, you know, with that shipment, or they could suspect trademark violations. There's lots of different reasons why they might pull your goods and inspect them. But they're typically inspected by a clearance officer, and the things they're looking at is checking the quantity, the properties, or the value of the goods. And they might do a partial inspection where they just pull a certain part of the consignment, or they might do a full inspection where they inspect the entire inventory of those goods. And obviously that requires you to unpack certain selection of goods, and that can increase the chances of damage being done to the goods themselves. So that really all we can do as importers and exporters is to make sure that our paperwork is in check, and that doesn't raise any particular suspicions. And that means that those inspections are more for those goods with those additional requirements placed upon them, rather than your goods, which may be standard goods. So as importers and exporters, it's vital that we are making accurate declarations, and that we're providing all of the relevant supporting paperwork. And then we know that border control posts will be used significantly more. So all consignments of animals or animal products moving from the EU into the UK will go through a border inspection post from the beginning of July. Or border control posts, I should say. We're not really calling them BIPs anymore. And similarly, from the 1st of January, any exports from the UK to the EU will go through border control posts in the EU. So you'll remember me talking in previous sessions how we've got this phasing in of import requirements here in the UK. We don't have that in the EU. So border control posts will be used for UK goods from the 1st of January within the EU, but we won't see the full implementation of border control posts in the UK until the 1st of July. And then we know there's going to be duties and import VAT applied to our goods, EU goods coming into the UK, and similarly to UK goods going into the EU. So depending on the Incoterms that you have agreed with your customers or your suppliers will determine who's responsible for those duties and import VAT. So we go back to these points that I've raised in previous sessions, where those Incoterms are absolutely imperative. And then we know that there are a host of customs simplified procedures that can help us speed up the flow of goods, but also importantly help us suspend the rate of duty and import VAT that's applied to those goods if they go into a certain procedure. And we'll cover off some of those later on. Okay, so I just wanted to give a current example of intra-EU dispatch and acquisition, if you like. So how it's worked over what seems like forever is that goods that have been produced in the EU, or they've maybe been imported into an EU country and had the duty paid, so they've been cleared into free circulation. They've been able to go anywhere within the EU member states, the remaining EU member states, without any further restrictions or duties. So customs duty and import VAT has not been payable on goods that we've brought in from the EU, because they've been in free circulation and we've referred to them as acquisitions rather than imports. Duty's obviously been payable on imports from outside the EU, where those third country rules apply, but that duty is typically paid when they first enter the EU, unless there's any kind of transit agreement in place where the goods can travel within the EU before being cleared at the point of destination. But those goods coming in from the EU, where there's no preferential trade agreement in place, we've been paying import duties and import VAT, as we will do on EU goods moving forward if there's no trade agreement. Obviously, there are certain situations where this doesn't apply. So if they're coming into a customs warehouse or a bonded warehouse, and that duty and VAT is suspended until they're released into free circulation or re-exported, or perhaps they've come into a procedure like inward processing for processing or repair. Okay, so the example I've given here is we've got a supplier in Oxford and a customer in Lisbon. So it's been so straightforward. The goods are available at the exporter's premises. The goods are loaded onto the transport. They travel to the port of dispatch, which here I've just suggested Portsmouth, because I know that goes Portsmouth, Bilbao, there's the route. The goods are presented at customs at the port of dispatch. There's really minimal kind of clearance takes place, and the goods are loaded onto the vessel. They leave the EU, they leave the UK. The exporter doesn't have to maintain any proof that the goods have left the UK because they're in free circulation. The vessel sails, it gets to Bilbao, the goods are presented to customs there, they're cleared, again, minimal clearance formalities, and then they enter Spain, and they can transit through to Lisbon in Portugal with no problem whatsoever, because those goods are in free circulation. So they go from the UK to Spain to Portugal without any further checks or any kind of duties being paid. Okay, now how this changes from the 1st of January. So I've taken the top part of the example, so we're just looking at the export here. So again, the goods are available at the exporter's premises. But the exporter may have had to do some pre-checks in terms of the documentation that's required to clear the goods in the country of destination. They may have had to check that they can actually ship to that particular company, again, depending on the commodity that's been shipped. So those controlled goods or those goods with additional requirements placed upon them, then there may be pre-export formalities that the exporter needs to be aware of. But then the goods are loaded on the transport. I'll come back to the packaging in just a second. And the goods travel to the port of dispatch. And this is where those additional customs formalities come in. So when the goods are presented to customs at the port of dispatch. So on the wooden packaging issue, because this hasn't really been covered an awful lot in terms of Brexit preparedness, ISPM 15, it's the international standard for phytosanitary measures. So it's global regulation, and the whole purpose of it is to prevent the spread of plant diseases and pests that might be transmitted through that packaging material, or pallets specifically is the one that is concerning everybody at the moment. So that regulation, if you like, requires that wood to be heat treated or cleaned in some way to prevent that contamination and the spread of any pests. And then they also have to carry a specific marking to confirm that they're legal in the EU. Now, currently the UK still doesn't have sufficient pallets to be accepted, if you like, in the EU from the 1st of January. So as we are at the minute, because we're part of the EU, we're exempt from those standards because we're an EU member state and we follow a much more relaxed set of regulations. And the truth is that DEFRA still doesn't have a handle on exactly how many ISPM 15 compliant pallets we're going to need ahead of the transition period. So some companies have begun to look at plastic alternatives to overcome this. It's really not being addressed. It's certainly not addressed in the border operating model. And it's clearly a regulatory hurdle that's either going to go away or needs to be resolved quite quickly as a matter of urgency. But then going back to the kind of documentation and the procedures. So we've touched on safety and security declaration. So because it's export, the likelihood is that the safety and security declaration would be part of the full export declaration that would have been made by the exporter or his or her customs intermediary before the goods are shipped, and then will be processed at the time the goods are at the port of dispatch. Okay. Again, talking that export declaration is that C88 that we've looked at before. But there might be, depending on the commodity, that's being exported, there might be a need for a license. So you might need a license, or you might need to follow specific rules if you export restricted goods. So they could be, when we think about licenses, we think about military goods, dual-use goods, so those goods that can be used in both civilian and military applications. But there are other products as well. So medical devices, chemicals, drugs, waste, diamonds, fine arts. Diamonds require a Kimberley certificate. Arts require an export license because they're kind of national treasures that we want to know if they're leaving the UK, why they're leaving, and when can we expect them back. So they're temporary export for an exhibition, or they're going out to an auction house and they're not expected to be coming back. So there might be a license requirement. There might be, depending on the commodity you're shipping, there might be a phytosanitary certificate required. So that's where you're certifying that those goods have been, or that material's been inspected, it's considered free from pests, and it conforms to the plant health regulations in the importing country. So products that would fall into that category would be any trees, wood, bark, soil, or forestry seed. Also non-manufactured wood products in the form of packaging. So that's where pallets come into place as well. There might be a requirement for an export health certificate. We'll talk about those a little bit later when we talk about additional documentation. There might be a catch certificate requirement as well, which we'll talk about in a second. And then carnets. So most countries will have a limit on the value of goods that you can bring in duty-free. So if you're taking goods into another country temporarily, so taking goods into the EU after the end of this year for business reasons, and you think you'll be over that duty-free limit, then you can usually get an OTA carnet to avoid paying that duty. So things that would be covered under an OTA carnet would be things like samples to show at trade fairs or sales meetings, publicity materials, any kind of recording equipment for like film and audio. There's quite a good list, and you can find those on the gov.uk website. And then finally, there might be an origin certificate. So we've talked about origin certificates before as being a requirement for both preferential and sometimes non-preferential trade. So obviously, if there's an EU-UK trade agreement signed, then we'll see more preferential certificates or movement certificates issued with our goods when they're going into the EU. But similarly, I think I've touched on before that there are some nations like the Arab League of Nations that when we're exporting to them, they insist on knowing the origin of the goods that they're bringing into their country. So that's why you'd have a non-preferential certificate of origin. Okay, so that just shows, I suppose, a layer of complexity to the export process, depending on the commodity that you're shipping. And then I've pulled I know I've taught you, we did an actual specific webinar on this as well about the border operating model. I have pulled a process flow from there for products of animal origin. That document, I know it's heavy reading, 200+ pages, but it's fantastic. It will provide these process flows for different product groupings. So the one I'm showing you here is the export procedure for products of animal origin from the 1st of January, because remember, the EU isn't affording us any kind of phasing in. We're going to have to grapple with these new processes pretty much off the starting block on the 1st of January. So under this process, you can see that the UK exporter has to source an official vet or an environmental health officer who can certify that the goods can be exported. So I know I've mentioned to you before, companies like Amivet, they issue health certificates for meat, dairy, food and animal products. The EU importer needs to check that it can actually import those goods from the exporter in the UK. Are they approved to export these goods? Goods and documentation have to be routed through a border control post, so we know that's in place from the 1st of January in the EU, so that affects the route of the goods that our products go through. If the goods aren't harmonised, then there might be other requirements placed upon them, so that would be referring them to APHA, which is the Animal Plant and Health Agency, if the goods aren't harmonised. Then the UK exporter makes the export entry, which, as we say, operates as the export summary declaration as well. And the EU importer has to pre-notify their system, so that their body, if you like, with just traces, which we were previously part of traces, and obviously as part of leaving the EU, we've withdrawn our membership of that, if you like. But that's the EU's platform for sanitary and phytosanitary certification. So it's required for any import of animal products from anywhere into the EU. Okay, so it's the equivalent of AFA in the UK. And then those goods are routed through, like I say, the border control posts in the EU before hopefully being cleared and shipped on to your customer. Okay, so a lot more complexity, the kind of complexity that only applies to third countries currently. Now, if we flip back to my diagram and we look at the import side of things, so when the goods arrive at the port of arrival in Bilbao, then they'll be subject to tariffs and so on according to the EU Common External Tariff. But if we flip it for a second and think that we're importing into the UK, so in the absence of a UK-EU free trade deal, tariffs will be applied here in the UK according to the new border operating model, so the UK global tariff. And on the flip side, if they're being imported into the EU, then those tariffs will be based on those third country duties within the EU Common External Tariff. Okay, so import declarations are required at import into the EU and similarly import into the UK, irrespective of whether or not there's a UK trade deal. We've got those border formalities and those customs formalities to navigate, irrespective of whatever the trade deal is that's negotiated. The same level of documentation requirements for goods coming into the UK as in the EU, really, but we know we've got that phased implementation process. So if I was to take those importers of products of animal origin in the UK, they would have up until April the 1st next year to produce an export health certificate, for example. Okay, and we know that those physical documentary and identity checks will increase for certain goods when they're going into the EU or coming into the UK. And as I said earlier, by the 1st of July, all goods requiring that inspection will be routed through designated border control posts within the UK. So there's a number of ports that are gearing up to be able to handle those additional checks, if you like. So then taking another example from the border operating model. So again, products of animal origin, but this time we're importing them into the UK. The procedure is similar, but this time the importer is a UK company, so the systems are slightly different. So it's IPAFs that would, the system in the UK rather than EU traces that manages that pre-notification process. So the process is pretty much the same. There's that check to make sure that you can import from that certain exporter. There's a course of action if the goods are not harmonised. There's the requirement for a full import declaration and pre-notification, and then you've got the same notion, at least from the 1st of July, of those border control posts being in place, and those physical and documentary inspections that will take place on certain goods before hopefully the goods are cleared and they can continue on to their destination, which is the UK company that's bought them here in the UK. So again, just showing the level of complexity, but this time from an import perspective, so goods coming into the UK, and again from the 1st of July, because we're talking about border control posts, which won't actually be fully implemented till the 1st of July. Okay. Anybody that joined the border operating model webinar will remember this graphic that I showed then. I really do like this. It shows kind of the level of involvement of different government bodies and databases in declaration. So at the centre, we've got Chief, that I'm going to talk to you about in a second, which is the kind of software that underlies declarations currently, and which third-party software interfaces with. But then you've got a number of different systems and bodies that are involved in the declaration, whether it be on a permission basis or whether it be on a notification basis. So on the permission side, you've got ECHO, which is the Export Health Certificates Online. You've got VMD, which is Veterinary Medicine Database. You've got UK REACH, which is the Chemicals Registration Database. And then on the notify or the notification side of things, you've got IPAS, I can't say that today, which is the Imported Products, Animals, Food and Feed System. You've got PEACH, which I know I've referenced before, which is that procedure for electronic application for certificates from horticultural marketing inspectorate. What a mouthful that is. And then you've got the excise movement and control system for those specific excise goods. So there are so many systems that are triggered and called into action by the filing of an import or an export declaration. I just think this is a fantastic way of depicting that. I want to talk a little bit because I'm not sure at the moment who is looking to file their own declarations and who is going to outsource that to a customs intermediary. But you've got two systems that are currently working in parallel at the moment. You've got Chief, which is the long-standing customs handling of import-export freight. And it has been in operation for decades. It works very well, but the fact is it's not scalable. So we know that the volume of declarations in the UK is going to go from about 55 million to 255 million, and Chief just simply couldn't have coped with that volume, so it's not scalable. It's built on old technology, and that important management information that we all need. So I think I've mentioned in previous sessions, even when we're using a customs intermediary, we need to be routinely checking on the entries that they're making on our behalf to check things like URI numbers, CPC codes, commodity codes, make sure that they're entering data correctly. To obtain that data from Chief is currently chargeable. So there's a number of reports that you can subscribe to monthly, but the cost can build. So Chief was meant to have been decommissioned last year, but there were some extensions to its pilot phase, and it's understood that it's running alongside CDS at the moment. So CDS is the new HMRC system. It stands for Customs Documentation Service. It's built on up-to-date technology. It's scalable. It has that management information free of charge. It's got a whole host of expanded features. But in terms of what it means for us filing declarations, there's some slight changes. So when I've shown you the C88 before, which is based on the fields within Chief, you'll notice that I refer to boxes, and those boxes are numbered. So with CDS, the notion of boxes disappears and is replaced by data elements. As importers and exporters, we're not required to give any additional information. It's more where that information goes. So CDS takes the data that would have gone in a box within the Chief system and breaks it into different data elements. Now, what does this mean for you if you're filing your own declarations? If you are filing your import and export declarations, then you're typically engaging with a third-party software provider that has these fields mapped to the underlying fields in Chief or CDS. They will have been working on beta versions of CDS for some time now, so they'll have mapped all of those fields importantly. If you're just doing export declarations only, then you might be accessing the national export system, which doesn't require you to enlist the services of a customs intermediary or buy that third-party software. You can access the national export system via a kind of web client, if you like. Or you might be using a customs intermediary, and only they will know which system they're currently using, whether it's Chief or CDS. But I just thought it would be good to know, because we're talking about declarations at the moment. It's always quite nice to know the underlying software and what that means for you as a user of that software if you're going to self-represent on your declarations. Okay, I wanted to talk about representation. So this is a snapshot of the C88, and in box 14, that's where the declarants or the representatives data goes. So if you were making the declaration yourself, say it's an export declaration, then your details would be in box 2 as a consignor. but then your details would also be in box 14 because you're self-declaring, you're self-representing. But if you use an agent, then they can represent you in two different capacities. So they can represent you in a direct capacity or an indirect capacity. So in box 14, if you had an agent, you would expect to see your agent's details in there. And then they denote which capacity they were working for you under by selecting 2 or 3. So 2 for direct representation and 3 for indirect. Why do I raise it? Because essentially you have to understand in what capacity you're being represented. So if an agent is operating on a direct representation basis, then they are acting 100% on your instructions. So providing you have given them full instructions and they've followed those to the word. If there's any issue regarding the misdeclaration of goods, or goods are held up because the documentation isn't what it ought to be, then that agent operating in a direct capacity bears little to no liability. Okay, so that's direct, and most agents will be operating on a direct capacity basis. Indirect representation is where agents share a certain level of responsibility and what's the other word I'm looking for, and liability for when things go wrong. Historically, we've seen this where the freight forwarding company might be a sister company to the importer or exporter, so they've been linked in some way, and that's typically been where agents have only wanted to act in that capacity when they've had some link with the importer or exporter. But there were changes to the Union Customs Code back in 2016, which made it more difficult for agents to refuse to act in that indirect capacity. So the takeaway from this is, if you're using an agent to make your import or export declarations, you need to determine in what way they're representing you. Are they operating in a direct capacity whereby they're just operating on your instructions, or are they operating in an indirect capacity where they're sharing some of those responsibilities and liabilities? Okay, so that's why I wanted to raise that today, and it needs to be expressly stated in their terms and conditions so that everybody's clear. So back onto the customs declaration, so it's a C88 in its native format. Like we said before, if you're completing the paper-based version and everything's gone horribly wrong, the lights have gone off, and you know this is your last option for filing this declaration. But it is mandatory for import and exports with the EU from the 1st of January. It looks more scary than it actually is. As I say, if you're using that third-party software, then it will navigate you through the fields that need to be completed. So when you make your initial declaration in box 1 and you're saying it's an export declaration, it will only present you with the fields that are relevant for an export declaration, and vice versa with import. But the things that it's capturing are, you know, who's involved in the declaration. So who's the trader, who's the agent, who's the customer. So who's the consignor, the representative, and the consignee. What goods are moving, so what are the commodity codes of the goods? And I think I said to you before, you can have the notion of single item declarations where you're just moving one item. Remembering that items are not as we would think about them as being units. Items are those goods that can be grouped by commodity code, customs procedure code, or country of origin. So you might have 10,000 units, but if they all share the same commodity code, then you've got one item on that declaration. But then you can have multi-item declarations, so you can have anything up to 99 items per import or export declaration. They need to know why the goods are moving. So are they a temporary or permanent import or a permanent export? Are they moving into some kind of special customs procedure like inward processing or bonded warehouse? That's where the CPC code comes into play, and we'll cover that later on in a slide. And they need to know how much. So what's the value, the quantity, and the weight of the goods that are being moved? And then how are they being moved? So are they going by sea, air, road? So we're capturing on the declaration the mode of transport. And then which type of goods are moving. So as we discussed before, not all goods will require a license or a certificate, but if they do, then that needs to be captured on the declaration. So not only does that certificate or license need to accompany the goods, it needs to be referenced on the declaration, and that would be referenced in box 44. And then we need to know where where are the goods coming from and where they're going to. So what's the country of dispatch and the country of destination. So that's really a whistle-stop tour of that C88, the kind of data that we're capturing. But then the C88 and the commodity code that you have declared and the customs procedure that's involved will dictate whether or not you require any additional documentation to accompany the goods. Just before I move on to the next slide, so one thing I did want to mention, and I said in the very beginning, was when we've submitted a declaration and it's been processed and we later find out that there's an error. So HMRC have 2 online forms. It's the form C81 for export and the form C285 for import. Export's more straightforward because you don't have that duty and VAT liability that could have been influenced by making an inaccurate declaration. On the import, rather than rush to complete the C285, it's advisable to contact your local customs office and seek advice because they may have a different course of action for you to do before you complete that form. So export is a little bit easier. Import, I would say, start with your local customs authority and customs office, but they're how you amend declarations that have already been processed and you subsequently find out that there's been an error. Okay. Additional documentation, don't want to labour this too much because we've covered it in previous sessions, but it's really important that you know which documentation needs to accompany your goods. So we know that there's standard documentation like your commercial invoice, your packing list and so on, but then there's also specific documentation that will relate to the commodity you're shipping. So your commodity might dictate that you need a certificate of origin or a certificate of conformity or a license or so on. So everything, all of that information, as we said the other week when we were talking about product classification, it all hangs off the commodity code. Okay. But commercial invoice is one of the ones I would point out in terms of making sure you've got all of the information on there. And we're going to cover off CPC codes or customs procedure codes towards the end of the presentation because we know that freight forwarders are asking particularly exporters to make sure that they're on the commercial invoice. But other things that you're catching, country of origin, where each item was manufactured or sourced, if you like, you know, where it's wholly obtained. That's a mandatory thing on import, but not on an export declaration. It's only mandatory if you're dealing in cap goods. And you're capturing the commodity code and the customs procedure code that we'll come on to in a second. You're also capturing the currency of the goods. So on import, HMRC has its own rates of exchange, and Chief being the main system at the minute, interfaces with those exchange rates. So there's a conversion that happens automatically. But if you have agreed a fixed rate of exchange as part of a commercial contract, then that needs to be put on the commercial invoice and then it can be referenced in the relevant box. I think it's box 44 on the C88 one for those goods that are imported. And really importantly, we're capturing the Incoterms being used and the means and cost of transport. We talked about packing lists before, so they have to be compliant, they have to be easily understood by everybody that engages with your goods throughout the supply chain. So anybody moving them or handling them or receiving them in the end, they're required for all sea freight and air freight shipments. So they're really, really important to get them accurate. And I know I've mentioned to you before that sometimes it's almost as good to use the commercial invoice without the commercial data in there. Certificates of inspection, we've talked about how some countries might require these pre-shipment, and we've talked about third parties such as Bureau Veritas, Intertech and SGS that can do that. We've talked about preference agreements and certificates of origin. And we talked about, I'm pretty certain that I've explained to you that those EU, excuse me, EUR1 and and ATR certificates will no longer be valid for UK origin exports. They'll be replaced by the Chambers by a new UK version, and they'll only issue them where there's that preferential free trade agreement in place. Similarly, with the EC certificates of origin, they won't be valid for UK exports at the end of the year, and the Chambers are replacing those. We've also got export health certificates. So we talked about before how they're required for the shipment of live animals and animal products. They will be required for goods going into the EU from the 1st of January for those certain goods, and they will be required for EU goods coming into the UK from the 1st of April. So it's really important that you consult the border operating model if you have commodities that fall into that, live animals or animal products. Certificates of conformity, we've talked about these before. So, you know, fruit and vegetable consignments are going to need a certificate of conformity. So that will require the exporter to interface with Peach to get that certificate of conformity. Certificates of free sale, so they're those ones where we're testifying that those goods that are being released into free circulation, so we're importing them into the UK and releasing them into free circulation, or they're being released into the EU free circulation, then they comply with the relevant regulation. So DEFRA issues them for goods that come into contact with animals, so any veterinary medicines, Department of Health for medicines, Health and Safety Executive for biocides. So there's different government bodies that get involved in those certificates of free sale depending on what the commodity is. And certificates of analysis, so we talked about before, these can be a requirement for food products or wines or spirits or chemicals. This is where the goods have to be tested before they can be exported, and they have to have that certificate of analysis to accompany them. So that testing can be done at your premises as the exporter, or it can be done at the location where the goods have been loaded for transport. And then the last one I wanted to mention was catch certificates. So from the 1st of January, UK companies will need to obtain a validated catch certificate for the export of fish into the EU, and you need a separate certificate for each consignment, and there are certain timeframes depending on the mode of transport. So it has to be issued to the importer in advance of the goods arriving in the EU, so they can help clear the goods at customs. And obviously you have more time to file that with the importer if the goods are going by sea than you do if they're going by road. Okay. Product classification, so we've talked about how important this is, how it's part of our compliance. We must be classifying our goods correctly to make sure that as an importer we're paying the right rates of duty and VAT, and also we're feeding into the correct statistics. But similarly, on the export side of things, you need to be helping your customers remain compliant as well. So you need to be helping them to make sure that they are importing the goods correctly. When we're importing goods, it is the importer's responsibility to be compliant with HMRC. So you may receive a commercial invoice from your supplier that has the goods classified under a certain commodity code. On doing your own research and checking in the tariff, you might decide that actually that wouldn't be right to import the goods under that. So you can change the commodity on the import entry, and then reference it throughout the rest of your material. Your documentation, sorry. So we've talked about product classification before. We're talking about what is the product, what's it made of, what are its essential characteristics, how does it work, and importantly, how's it presented or packaged to customs. So some commodities might have a different code depending on whether they're loose to when they're packaged. So it's really important that you're conducting that product classification. We've talked about contacting HMRC and finding tariff information in the past, so hopefully you're remembering that. Determining country of origin. So we've talked before about where goods are wholly obtained. It's straightforward, it's simple. So there's those vegetables that are harvested in a country will originate there, animals that have been born and raised will originate in that country, and minerals extracted will originate there. But it's a little bit different with manufactured products. So we know that we bring in components from around the world, and it can be a little bit challenging to determine the origin of those goods. So there are these different rules that apply in different free trade agreements. So obviously it's very different. It's very difficult at the moment to determine what the origin of our goods are, because we don't know what the origin protocols are going to be in any EU UK free trade agreement. But as I've talked to you about before, any kind of raw material that we purchase from the EU that go towards manufacturing our goods in the UK, or similarly any processing that happens in the EU, if there's no free trade agreement in place, then we won't be able to use those components to kind of come up with our accumulation of origin. And similarly, in any trade agreement that's negotiated, we don't know whether there'll be that notion of bilateral accumulation. So they might, if the trade agreement is negotiated, they might say, actually, the EU manufacturers can continue to use UK components and processing power as part of their accumulation, and vice versa in the UK, and then we trade those goods between us. We just don't know at the minute. So as I've said to you before in these calls, the best thing to do is to start examining your bill of materials to understand what those potential non-originating components, those components that originate from outside of the UK, what they are and what kind of value they make up of your goods, and what level of processing you do in the UK. That's all we can do at the moment, and we wait with bated breath for any news. But I wanted to give you a couple of examples of these rules that I've just mentioned. So the transformation rule is one that we see. I've taken a rule straight from the EU-Canada trade agreement, because the UK keeps saying that's the trade agreement that it wants to strike with the EU. And this is where it says that a change from any heading or subheading outside of a group, only non-originating material classified outside of the group, or headings or subheading, blah, blah, blah. It's quite lengthy. But essentially what it's saying is that the product, the finished goods, will be deemed to have originated, let's say in the UK, if the non-originating components have a different heading in the tariff. So we can see those non-originating components being the leather and the zip and the metal fastener for the suitcase. They all have a different chapter in the tariff to what the finished goods do. Okay, so I've given you the first 4 digits of the suitcase and the first 4 digits of the others. And providing it's a change of tariff classification, then that product would be deemed to meet the transformation rule. Okay, but then applying the other rule, which is the ad valorem, or the value added rule, that's where we say that the value of non-originating components can't exceed a certain threshold of the ex works price. And it's complicated further by, when we're calculating the cost of those non-originating materials, we have to base that cost on what we call the landed cost of the product. So it includes all the freight and insurance to get the goods here. That's the cost that we place on those non-originating components. In this scenario, so again, taken from the EU-Canada trade agreement, we're talking about those stoves made of iron, and the threshold is set at 50%. But we can see that the non-originating components exceed that threshold and actually account for 61% of the ex works price. So that product wouldn't qualify for preferential origin. Okay, so it will very much depend on the origin protocols in any negotiated free trade agreement as to which rules apply to certain product groupings and so on and so forth. We just don't have sight of that at the moment. I wanted to talk about customs valuation. So we know that the dutiable value of our goods is not always what's reflected on the commercial invoice from our supplier. Okay, so we use the WTO agreement on customs valuation, and it's used across all countries that subscribe to the WTO, and it prevents us as importers applying those arbitrary figures or kind of made up figures to our customs value. So obviously that determining that customs value is what enables HMRC to apply the right amount of duty and import VAT on those goods, and it also feeds into the accuracy of any trade statistics. Okay, so I just want to, like I said to you before, method 1 is used by some 90% of import declarations across the globe, so it's highly likely that you'll be using this on goods that you bring in from the rest of the world, and similarly moving forward on goods that you bring in from the EU. So under method 1, you have a certain amount of charges that you need to account for, and then you have the notion of deductions as well. So with method 1, you take the cost of the goods and you apply any delivery costs, any commissions, any royalties or license fees, but then you can also discount certain activity or certain costs. So dividends paid to the seller, for example, certain marketing activity, you'd be able to deduct those costs, if you like. You have to keep records of valuation build up for 4 years. So if HMRC was to audit you and they're looking at your customs valuation, they can ask to see your valuation build up records going back 4 years. Okay, so it's really important that you familiarise yourself with the value method that you're using. And Customs Notice 252, as I've mentioned before, is the go-to place for that. Okay. Oh, steaming on. I'm going over time as per usual. I think I've given this example before, but it just reiterates, and you can read through it on the slides when you get them from Sam later. But it just reiterates that we're taking the price of the goods. We add all of our freight and insurance, any additional charges like tooling charges or packaging that's not represented on the commercial invoice. We can make a deduction for dividend payment, and then we get our CIF value. And it's on the CIF value that the duty, which here is 8.5%, is applied. And then that duty is added to the CIF value, and that gives us our VAT value, and that's what our VAT's applied to. So the actual landed cost of the goods, or the price to clear the goods in the UK, is over 50% higher than it looked on the commercial invoice if the VAT isn't recoverable. And we'll come on to VAT in a little bit. Okay, so that's the transaction value. Payment of duty and VAT, a couple of things I wanted to mention here. So I've taken a portion of the C88 again, so it's box 47. It only applies to imports because it's all around import duty and VAT. On there, HMRC or Chief establishes different line items depending on the type of duty. So if that duty is import duty, and then there's another line item for import VAT, and then if there's any excise duty or anti-dumping duty, they'd be separate line items. And there are codes that go into the method of payment column, so that last 5th column, which tell customs how you're going to pay that duty. So if you're settling up immediately by cash, then the code against duty and VAT would be A. If you're deferring to a duty deferment account that we've talked about before and how they can benefit you, then it would be F against the duty and perhaps the VAT. And then you put your duty deferment account number in box 48, or you might be using a freight forwarder's deferment account number. And then with the new border operating model, some of you that have consulted it will see that we're now able to use postponed VAT accounting for the import VAT on the goods coming in from the EU and the rest of the world. So you can have quite possibly a line item for duty that says that you're using the deferment account, but then a line item for VAT where you put G that tells HMRC that you're using postponed VAT accounting. So in that scenario, the duty and the VAT is instantly offset against those various different accounts, and the goods clear really, really quickly. Okay, motoring through. General customs compliance. So a few things I pick on here that I know we haven't talked about before is it is incumbent on us as the economic trader, if you like, or the economic operator, to make sure that we are compliant in these areas. So we're classifying the goods correctly, we're paying the right level of import duty, and we're able to demonstrate how we're doing that valuation build up, so the dutiable value is correct. We're responsible for, when we're trading under preference, we're responsible for determining the origin of the goods. Denied party screening is sometimes referred to as restricted party screening, and it relates to the process of checking a potential business partner or customer against a denied or sanctioned party list. HMRC's got public lists of those who are currently subject to those financial sanctions because they're believed to be involved in terrorist activity or something like that. So you need to be consulting those lists periodically and making sure that you're doing that screening against customers and suppliers. You're responsible for the control of export licenses where required, your customs declarations and any simplified procedures that you have authorization for, that they're correctly represented on the customs declaration. We've talked about Intrastat before and how that changes in light of Brexit. And then we are responsible, if we're employing the services of a freight forwarder, we're responsible for making sure that we instruct them correctly, and really that we're checking their work. So we're making sure that the entries they're making on our behalf are compliant and correct. Okay, we've just very briefly, we've kind of talked in the past about the tariff and how that keeps us straight in terms of the duty and VAT that are payable. It tells us whether duty's been suspended on any of our goods. Tells us if there's any preferential duty rates applied, whether there's any anti-dumping duties apply. Tells us whether we need an import or an export license, what certifications required to accompany the goods. Know what additional duties like excise duty applies. So in the case of alcohol and tobacco, it's really important. And also tells us whether there's any sanctions and embargoes, so whether we can actually physically ship the goods to a country or physically receive goods from that country. And of course, providing we're correctly classifying our goods and we're abiding by everything laid out on the tariff, then we're avoiding the seizure of goods or delays to their movement. And then importantly, we're avoiding any penalties from HMRC as well. So we're avoiding having to pay interest on payment back for incorrect classification, whereby we might have incorrectly declared goods and paid less duty or VAT than we should do. And remember, HMRC can go back 4 to 5 years when requesting underpayment of duty. And if they've uncovered it in an audit rather than us being proactive and notifying them, then they can stamp a lovely penalty on top of there as well. Okay, so there's lots of very practical reasons why we need to be compliant. The other area of compliance, which I touched on before, is the proof of export. So where we're exporting, which we will be exporting to the EU from the 1st of January, we will be zero rating VAT on our commercial invoices. And when we do that, we need to be able to prove that the goods have physically left the UK, so they've physically been exported within 90 days of that declaration being processed. Okay, so there are various different levels of proof that HMRC would accept if they did an audit. There's that commercial evidence and official evidence. And then you have to supply that supplementary evidence. So what's in your export dossier? Hopefully you're keeping this kind of stuff in an export dossier anyway, and then that proof of export would just be added to it, okay? But you need to maintain that proof of export for 6 years. That's as far back as they can go. If you can't show that proof of export, or it's deemed to be insufficient and it doesn't meet, you know, what they wanted to, then you become liable for that VAT, which is not a situation you want to be in. Customs special procedures, I will allow you all, because I'm very conscious of time, I'll allow you to run through these in your own. There are probably, there's less for export than there are for import, as you would expect, because they are a mechanism to suspend duty and import VAT, so there's a lot more for import. But then I just wanted to cover off one last slide, which is around that customs procedure code, because they are being required, they are being requested by partners where they're making declarations on our behalf. So it's a 7-digit number. The first 4 digits go in the first subdivision and the last 3 digits go in the last subdivision. It tells customs authorities the procedure to which the goods are being entered. So and then the second subdivision is the procedure from which the goods are being withdrawn. And then the last 3 digits are purely for statistical and financial purposes for HMRC. So on a permanent export, you'd expect to see the code that I've given there, 1000-001, permanent import 4000-000, because that's saying that you're exporting the goods, you're not expecting them back, and you're importing the goods and they're for free circulation in the UK and you're not expecting them to be re-exported. But when goods are coming into special procedures, so inward processing, you'd see 5100-000, and then how you see the build up. So when goods are coming into inward processing from customs warehousing, you'll see a different combination. Now, customs intermediaries are great support in compiling these, but you need to have an appreciation of what these are yourself, especially if you're using simplified procedures. And the last example I've given you just shows how those last 3 digits are used. So that denotes that it's an export of low value. So it's a 097 that tells customs for statistical purposes that those goods had a lesser value than £800. Okay, so the CPC codes are really important. I'm so sorry, I've gone way over time again. As per usual, I've given all of the information at the back here, lots of different links for signposting. And yes, that's it from me. I will just have a quick look in the Q&A.
You have some question, Andrea.
We do. I'm just going to take a quick look at them now. So one from Stephen: if we ship X works, do we have to do anything relating to import taxes? No, absolutely not, Stephen. If you're shipping X works, The problem with ex-works is that you are asking your customer to make the export declaration in the UK. So they're going to have to have a GB URI number, and they're going to have to navigate HMRC. So where possible, ex-works isn't a term that we should be using anyway. I don't know whether I've mentioned it before. There's a vulnerability over where the goods, who loads the goods and who's responsible during those goods being loaded. If possible, could you move to free carrier your premises, and that means you're making the export declaration and you're relieving your customer from having to do that, and you're also removing that vulnerability around the loading of goods at your premises. If there's, so this is from Carol, if there's an error on the declaration C88 but does not the same duty due, do we need to report to HMRC? There are certain thresholds that HMRC will allow of certain margins of error. You've got to remember that the declaration serves not just a import duty and VAT purpose, but it's also for statistical purposes. So I don't have a firm answer for you on that. I think in any situation like that, it's best to consult HMRC if it's well, it is an import declaration because you're talking about duty. I would speak to the customs office. It's far best to fess up and be honest, because like I say, if it's uncovered as part of an audit, then you know, that can be a bit of a pain point. Then we've got Adam. So we purchase computer motherboards, CPUs, RAM and other parts, which mainly come from China. They're then imported into the UK and assembled into a complete unit. This whole unit is then exported out soon. Does this mean that the origin of our product should be China, or would it be the UK as we assemble it here and install software on it? It's difficult. I'd have to know the kind of component parts and what percentage were of Chinese origin to be able to determine that. One thing you might want to look at, which would relieve you from paying the import duty to get those goods from China, especially if you're then re-exporting them, say to the EU, you could bring them in under inward processing, which would allow you to suspend the duty and import VAT on those goods while you're processing them in the UK. If they're then subsequently re-exported to the EU, then that VAT and import duty doesn't become payable. So that would be a superb way of limiting your exposure to those duties. As with the origin side of things, I think it's important to understand different rules, how much of those components make up the ex-works price of the goods, and are you doing sufficient by adding your software to actually maybe change the tariff heading, for example. So it's a little bit difficult to answer without seeing the bill of materials, for example. What's the quickest way to raise OPR? So OPR, I'm assuming you're referring to outward processing, maybe, which was previously known as outward processing relief. You have to apply to HMRC for that authorization. There's 2 or 3 different types. You can have full authorization that allows you to use OPR on unlimited consignments, and then you can have authorization by declaration that limits it to 3 times a year, but you have to apply to HMRC for that authorization. Wow, ladies, I'm sorry I've gone way over my time again.
Don't worry. Have you seen the question in the chat as well, Andrea?
Oh, have we got more in the chat? So, oh, yeah, my goodness.
People,
no, I hadn't.
delegates have put questions in Q&A and the chat.
Oh, okay, let me have a quick look then. So, when are you finishing for Christmas? That's not for me, I take it. I'm not, actually. I think I'm working through. Will you get a copy of the PDF? Absolutely. Sam will get that to you once I get the slides to her. Recording, yes. We export microbes used as a soil container. The commodity code indicates it requires a vet certificate for entry into Ireland. This product is bacteria, fungi naturally found in the soil. Who would be good to discuss this with? You could start with HMRC initially, but AFA would probably be your best point to call for that. TSS has said that if you use CDS and Chief, you need 2 direct debits to pay your deferment account. Do you need this if you're using a broker for shipments into Northern Ireland? Oh, it doesn't happen very often, but I can't really answer that one. I think that would be the best one would be to go back to the TSS service for that, unless you're asking me because they can't give you the answer, in which case Simon, if it would be all right if I just pull up my last slide with my contact details. If you want to drop me a quick line, it's something I can look into for you if you like. I don't have the answer for me today. How would this work if we're selling our goods via e-commerce direct to consumers, say? So e-commerce goods to Germany and Ireland. So e-commerce goods are a little bit complicated because it's that VAT issue for those bodies or individuals that aren't VAT registered. So currently we have the notion of distance selling thresholds that apply. They've been withdrawn because we've come out of the EU VAT directive. So we've kind of got a situation where if you want to continue supplying those consumer goods into those territories, then you have to apply for VAT locally in those countries where you're shipping those goods. There's a solution to that coming in July next year, which is called the one-stop shop, which will be applicable for consumer goods of under 150 euros, and it'll allow suppliers here in the UK to register as a non-union taxpayer in an EU member state and register for that service. So that's a way of continuing that supply. Inbound relief and outbound. Do you need CFSSP to do inbound relief and outbound relief? Would be important to GB Northern Ireland. Sorry, what CFSSP? You've thrown me there. If you're still on the call, Simon, can you clarify that for me? If you're not, then I don't know. Sam, is there any way of, yes, I suppose, just getting my details with the slides to Simon, and he can contact me separately?
We can do that. We can arrange that, Andrea. No problem.
I'm just
for temporary repair. Yeah, temporary repair and import. Thank you, Simon. You need to have that kind of temporary import. It is a custom special procedure, so you need to be authorized for that, and you typically need to have a guarantee or a duty deferment account for that as well, because you're effectively building up potential debt because you're temporarily importing those goods, so you're suspending that duty at the time. So it is a special procedure that you do need authorization for from HMRC. I might not have answered that perfectly, Simon, so if you want to drop me a quick email, feel free. I'm just conscious I've got another client just calling me, waiting to see where I am, because I was meant to be speaking to them at 3. So I do apologise, everyone, for going massively over time. And Simon, if you'd like to contact me separately, that would be wonderful. I'll look into it for you. But ladies, again, I'm sorry for going over again.
Andrea, we cannot thank you enough, for all this hard work, and people really, come back week after week. So it's very helpful, I'm sure, for all of you who have attended, and thank you for your support as well. And I hope it's useful to you. We're stopping now, as Sam said, for Christmas, and we're starting again in January. In the meantime, if you need any support and want to talk to a business advisor, please contact your local growth hub. And we're looking forward to seeing you again in January. And we hope by then we'll have a deal. And Andrea, thank you so much again, and see you soon.
You'd hope, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye. Bye. Bye.